Hello, my name is Salma Natalia Garcia Nava, and this is my evidence number 3. This evidence will talk about the important events that happened on the last 3 decades. First, we are going to start with the crisis of the socialist bloc. In the government head by Mikhail Gorbachev, want to maintain communist rule. In 1985, he introduced a process of domestic reforms in the Soviet Union, including the opening of the country's politics and economy to the West. This development facilitated changes in other Eastern Bloc states, which were not allowed to take their own development paths. In early 1989, the political and economic crisis in the Eastern Bloc intensified. It became clear that groundbreaking reforms were necessary. In Poland, the independent trade union Solidarność forced the regime to the negotiating table, achieving posts in the government by means of elections. Under pressure from the democratic opposition, the political leadership in Hungary began to implement gradual reforms. The Soviet Union began to show signs of disintegration, with the Baltic republics damaging independence. The head of the state and the communist parties in the GDR, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, however, refused to allow change. With this event, we passed to a really important event that was the globalization. And the globalization is a historical process of global integration in the economic, political, technological, social, and cultural spheres, which has made the world an increasingly interconnected place. In that sense, it is said that this process has made the world a global village. The progressive dissolution of economic and communicational borders has generated a capitalist expansion. This, in turn, has enabled investments and global financial transactions aimed at essential and emerging markets in terms that were previously very difficult, highly expensive, or unviable. The globalization process has modified the way in which countries and subjects interact and has generated great impact in economy, labor market, international trade, political, democratic systems, respect for human rights, and access to education, technology, and among others. Another event that was present on the last century was the terrorism. And the terrorism is the systematic use of terror used by a wide range of organizations, groups, or individuals in the promotion of their objectives, both by nationalists and non-nationalist political parties, right and left, as well by corporations, religious groups, racists, colonialists, independentists, revolutionaries, conservatives, and governments in power. Terrorism as a tactic is a form of violence that is distinguished by state terrorism, by the fact that in the latter case its authors belong to government entities. It also distinguishes from acts of war and war crimes, in that it occurs in the absence of war. Another important event that happened the last century was the unipolar world. Yes, the apparition of the unipolar world was after the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and the tension between the two blocs in a bipolar world. The United States emerged as a unipolar superpower. With this achieved great international influence, even in countries that have been part of the communist orbit. The presence of its huge military forces spread throughout the world and its interventions multiplied in various countries. The next event is the digital era. That is one of the most latest events. The digital era refers to the current era that offers a virtual space known as the Internet. This space is characterized by the speed of the communications that has transformed the social environment in which we live. Even our way of interacting, it is due to the use of information technology and communication. They are usually coined and dismantle new concepts, which simply adds the qualifier of digital. Then we got an interesting question. Why did the globalization emerge? Well, the globalization is the result of a long historical process that occurs due to the combination of a set of factors, which includes the development of navigation techniques, the expansion of commercial relations, and well as the dissemination of values, institution, and culture from Europe. What the human species has been experiencing since the end of the Cold War has been the last stage of the continuous process, which some sociologists and political scientists such as Daniel Vail, David Held, and Anthony Giddens, among others, identify as the post-society industrial, postmodernity, or contemporary globalization. Another interesting question is, in most cases, what caused the terrorist attacks of 20th century? Well, although people resort to terrorists for many reasons, experts attribute most acts of violence to three major factors, also specified in the last century. One of these causes is the political. Terrorism was originally theorized in the context of insurgency and guerrilla warfare, a form of organized political violence by a non-state army or group. Individuals, abortion clinic bombers, or groups like the Victory in the 1960s can be understood as choosing terrorism when they are trying to right what they perceive to be social, political, or historical wrong. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which stretched from 1968 to 1998, groups waged an ongoing campaign of violence against one another in Northern Ireland and in England, seeking political dominance. The religious is another of the most common cause in the last century. In 1990s, several attacks carried out in the name of religion made headlines. The Japanese doomsday called Aum Shinrikyo perpetrated two deadly sarin gas attacks in the Tokyo subways in 1994 and 1995, and in the Middle East, numerous suicide attacks since the 1980s have been celebrated as the world of Islamic marriage. Career terrorism experts began to argue that a new form of terrorism was on the rise, with concepts such as martyrdom and martyrdom seen as particularly dangerous. However, as thoughtful studies and commenters have repeatedly pointed out, such groups selectively interpret and exploit religious concepts and texts to support terrorism. Religions themselves do not cause terrorism. Another cause is the socioeconomic. Socioeconomic explanations of terrorism suggest that various forms of deprivation drive people to terrorism, or that they are more susceptible to recruitment by organizations using terrorist attacks. Poverty, lack of education, or lack of political freedom are a few examples. There is suggestive evidence on both sides of the argument. Comparisons of different conclusions are often confusing because they don't distinguish between individuals and societies, and they pay little attention to the nuances of how people perceive injustice or deprivation. The group Shining Path carried out a years-long campaign of violence against Peru's government in the 1980s and early 1990s in the attempt to create a Marxist state. We got another question related to the Cold War and the unipolar world. It is, how does the end of the Cold War relate with the unipolar world? Well, these events were related because after the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet bloc, the Western world became a dominant bloc. In this bloc, the United States of America will try to create a unipolar world against the wishes of many other countries to create a multipolar world. One of these questions is, how has the digital era influenced today's society? Well, the digital era has finally come to stay among us and manifest itself through a true technological revolution. Internet, computers, ICT devices and tools, forums, chats, blogs, media, etc. That is transforming clearly and deep habits, language, life, and customs of many people to create a new culture, the digital culture.